I apologize ahead of time, the video and audio drift apart. Sadly, I'm not very tech savvy. It might be best to merely listen rather than to watch as well. This is a series concerning which I would love to hear Dan McClellan's critiques on. I am sure that if he were to watch the entire series, there will be things that he would want to critique. I hope that Dan McClellan comes across these and gives his feedback. Was the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden? Let's take a look. The text seems to say that the tree was in the garden. Genesis 2:9, and the Lord God caused to sprout from the ground every tree pleasant to see and good to eat, and the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now I try to make the text make sense, and so yes, I do tend to use some mental gymnastics when applicable, and when it does not change the meaning of the text. I will not bend the text to make it say something it isn't. Verse 9 seems to be saying that both the tree of both the tree of life and the tree of knowledge were in the middle of the garden. But there is only one middle, and only one tree can occupy that point. However, it could be said that there are cases of one tree growing atop another tree. So the tree of knowledge could have been in the middle, and the tree of life grew on top of the tree of knowledge, thus both being in the middle, or vice versa, the tree of life grew and the tree of knowledge grew on top of the tree of life. But how else could this be so? Consider the idea of the garden being donut-shaped, with the middle not being part of the garden, but still in the middle of the garden. This would allow for an area, not a single point, an area that could allow for more than one tree, so that they were both in the middle of the garden. This would make it read much easier. Genesis 2:16, and the Lord God commanded man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. Verse 17, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for on the day that you eat thereof you shall surely die. The tree of knowledge would then not be part of the garden, and thus when God said, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, he was telling the truth. All of the trees that are actually part of the garden, feel free, go wild, eat them all. But this tree here, this is not part of the garden. Don't eat of it. Only eat of the trees of the garden. Think of it this way. There is a castle, and around the castle is a garden, like a moat, but rather a garden instead of the moat. The castle is not part of the garden. It is in the midst of the garden. Everything in the garden can be eaten, but don't eat anything in the castle. As far as I'm concerned, the tree of knowledge was not in the garden, but it was in the middle of the garden, such as the idea of a castle in the midst of a moat.